The kingdom of Waldhorn stood under a sky of endless blue, its ancient castles stretching proudly towards the heavens, a testament to centuries of rule. Towering mountains surrounded the land, their jagged peaks protecting the kingdom like a barrier against foreign invaders. Between the wild forests and fertile plains lay the heart of Waldhorn, the royal court, where decisions that shaped the future of the kingdom were made. The air here was thick with history, its very stones soaked with the blood and sweat of those who had come before. In the opulent hall of the royal palace, a grand feast was underway. The flickering light of countless candles reflected off polished stone walls, casting long dancing shadows that whispered of ancient secrets. The murmurs of the nobility rose in volume, each voice carrying the weight of ambition, pride, and power. At the far end of the hall, on a throne of black stone, sat King Aldric, the Alpha King, his golden eyes scanning the room with an expression of quiet authority. He was a figure of legend, the most powerful werewolf in all of Waldhorn, and his presence alone demanded respect. The nobles of the court, many of them clad in intricate garments of silk and fur, watched him closely, their eyes flicking between the king and the other attendees. Each noble house had sent their most prized daughters, each one eager to gain favor with the king, to secure their family's future. They were beautiful, graceful, and powerful in their own right, each with a wolf at her side, a bond forged from the bloodline of their ancestors. The ability to shift into a wolf was not merely a gift, it was the measure of one's worth, the foundation of nobility. To not shift was to be considered weak, to lack the strength of one's wolf. Among the noble daughters, one stood apart. Elysia of House Lornhaven was not like the others. She was tall, with dark hair that cascaded like a river of night over her shoulders. Her face was strikingly beautiful, but there was something in her eyes that set her apart from the others, a quiet intelligence, a thoughtful reflection that seemed to transcend the grandeur of the royal gathering. Elysia, unlike the other girls, could not shift. She had never been able to transform, and she carried this secret with her like a weight that pressed on her chest. Her wolf, a magnificent creature that had once been her constant companion, was gone, having long ago disappeared without a trace. It was a mark of shame, something her family had hidden from the court. Her father, Lord Varian Lornhaven, stood by her side, his stern face a mask of controlled anxiety. He had kept her secret hidden for years, but now, as the time drew near for the grand presentation, it became impossible to avoid. Every noble house in the kingdom would soon be watching, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would be revealed. "Father," Elysia whispered, her voice laced with unease. "What if they find out?" Lord Lornhaven's jaw tightened. "Do not worry, my dear. The king does not care for trivialities. Your beauty, your intelligence, these will be what set you apart." But even as he spoke the words, a cold dread filled Elysia's chest. She had heard the whispers of the other girls, their cruel jokes about how she would never be chosen. The rumors had spread, and many were already speculating that the king would choose the most powerful wolf, the daughter with the greatest abilities. Not her. The court had fallen silent as the king rose from his throne, his presence overwhelming the room. A deep hush spread across the gathering, as if the very air held its breath. The Alpha King, tall and imposing, walked toward the center of the room. His broad shoulders were draped in a cloak of deep crimson, a symbol of his dominance. His eyes, the color of amber, gleamed with an intensity that made every noble in the room feel small. With a voice like thunder, he spoke. "Tonight we choose a bride for the future of Waldhorn, a queen who will stand beside me as we lead this kingdom into a new age." Elysia's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Her future, the future of her house, would be decided in this moment. But what no one knew, what no one could anticipate, was that the king's gaze, sweeping across the room, would stop on her. And the choice he would make that night would change everything. The grand hall of the royal palace was bathed in a golden glow as the first rays of the evening sun streamed through the tall, arched windows. The air was thick with anticipation, every noble in the room brimming with nervous excitement. The ball had begun, but it wasn't the usual feast and music. Tonight was different. Tonight, the daughters of the kingdom would present themselves and their wolves before the Alpha King, in a ritual that determined not only their futures, but the future of Valdhorn itself. Elysia stood near the edge of the hall, her eyes scanning the other girls, her pulse quickening with each passing moment. Their poise, their beauty, it all seemed so effortless. Each of them exuded an air of confidence, their wolves beside them like silent, loyal sentinels. The creatures varied in size and color, each one a reflection of its owner's strength. The king would choose one to be his bride, and the rest would fade into obscurity. That was the way of things in Valdhorn. The crowd of nobles buzzed with idle chatter, their eyes eagerly flicking toward the king, seated upon his throne at the far end of the hall. King Aldric's gaze, however, was focused on something entirely different, the young women who were about to display their prowess. His reputation as the most powerful alpha in the land was no secret, and all knew that he would choose only the one who could prove herself worthy of standing at his side. Elysia shifted uncomfortably. She had always known this moment would come, but knowing it and experiencing it were two entirely different things. She felt exposed in a way she had never felt before, her secret, a secret she had carried for so long, threatening to unravel in front of the entire court. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, and for a moment she felt as if she might suffocate from the fear. Her father, standing by her side, leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Remember, Elysia, the king values strength. Show him your mind, your courage. Do not let them see your fear." Elysia nodded, though her mind was anything but calm. She glanced at the other girls, their expressions full of determination and excitement. Each one would shift tonight, revealing the power of their wolves. Each one would prove her worth through the bond she shared with her beast. And Elysia? She had nothing to show. The first girl, Lady Amara of House Valena, stepped forward. Her wolf, a massive beast with silver fur and piercing blue eyes, stood proudly beside her. The crowd gasped in awe as she shifted with graceful ease, her form transforming from human to wolf in a fluid motion. Her wolf bowed its head before the king, a perfect display of loyalty and power. The king nodded, his lips curling into a slight smile. "Impressive," he murmured. The next noble daughter, Lady Soraya of House Durenmont, presented her wolf, a sleek, midnight black creature, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. She too shifted with precision, her movements flawless. The room erupted in applause, and the king acknowledged her with a respectful nod. Elysia's heart pounded in her chest as each girl performed, each wolf more magnificent than the last. She could feel their eyes on her, judgment, expectation. The king would choose one of them, that much was clear. The thought made her stomach churn, but she had no choice. She had to go forward. Her name was called. "Elysia of House Lornhaven," the herald announced. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward her. Elysia could feel the weight of their gazes pressing down on her. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, and for a moment she thought she might stumble. But she steadied herself and stepped forward. Her father was by her side, a hand gently resting on her shoulder. He gave her a reassuring nod, but his expression was tight, filled with worry. Elysia could see it, the fear in his eyes, the hope that she would somehow succeed. As she walked toward the center of the room, she felt every eye on her, every whisper in the air. The king's gaze was sharp, calculating, and she had nothing to show him but her own frail humanity. No wolf to shift, no display of power. She stopped in front of the king, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of it all. The silence in the hall seemed to stretch forever. She could feel the eyes of the court, the nobles, the other girls, all waiting for her to speak, to act. Her throat was dry, her breath shallow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The pressure, the expectation, it was too much. But then she remembered her father's words. "Show him your mind, your courage." She took a deep breath, and with more strength than she thought she had, she spoke. "Your Majesty, I cannot shift. I have no wolf to present, but I offer myself, my heart, my loyalty, my intelligence. I can bring something that no wolf can, the strength of the mind." The room held its breath. Whispers fluttered through the court like the fluttering of wings. Alicia felt her body tremble, but she stood tall, her eyes never leaving the king's. King Aldric's amber eyes bore into hers, unblinking. There was a moment, just a brief moment, of silence. Then he nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Let us see what you have to offer, Lady Alicia." The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, but for the first time that evening, Alicia felt a flicker of hope. The whispers of the court echoed in the air like the rustle of distant wings, but Alicia's mind felt frozen. She had spoken her truth, declared her lack of the very thing that made noble women worthy in this kingdom, the power to shift. There had been a brief silence following her words, a moment in which time seemed to halt. Then the Alpha King had spoken, his voice echoing in the vast hall. "Very well," he had said, his tone calm yet commanding. "Let us see what you have to offer, Lady Alicia." And now, the tension in the room pressed against her chest, each noble's gaze a burning weight. Alicia stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart hammering against her ribcage. She was no stranger to pressure, but this was something else entirely. She had spoken, but now the king's scrutiny was on her. She could feel it like the flickering of flames, watching for the smallest misstep. She had expected judgment, maybe even mockery, but what she hadn't anticipated was the intensity in King Aldric's gaze. His amber eyes, sharp and calculating, held hers with an unwavering focus. He studied her in a way that made her feel as though he was seeing through her, searching for something she didn't quite understand. The king did not move, nor did he break eye contact. The court, too, had fallen into an uneasy silence. Alicia could hear the subtle tremor in her own breathing as she waited for him to speak again. Was he disappointed? Indifferent? She couldn't tell, and it gnawed at her. After what felt like an eternity, the king finally spoke, his voice low but rich, reverberating through the silence. "You speak of loyalty, of intelligence. Show me how you would serve this kingdom, Lady Alicia." His words struck her with the force of a cold wind. Serve this kingdom. The weight of those words carried more than just duty. It was an expectation of leadership, of strength. She hadn't been asked to shift, nor had she been asked to perform any grand display of skill. But this was a test nonetheless, one that would determine whether she was more than just her lack of a wolf. The silence hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Alicia's thoughts raced. What could she do? How could she prove herself? What could a girl without a wolf offer a king whose very power was derived from the wolf inside him? Then, a sudden realization struck her. She had never been defined by what she lacked. She had always found ways to make up for the absence of power with intelligence, with careful thought, and most of all with her ability to navigate the intricate politics of the noble world. She was not a warrior, not a shifter, but she was sharp, and she had always been able to read situations, to understand people's desires and fears. She straightened her back, her heart still pounding but now with renewed determination. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor that lingered just beneath the surface, "there are many ways to serve a kingdom. A wise ruler needs more than just a fierce wolf at their side. They need counsel, understanding, a steady hand to guide them through difficult decisions. I offer those things. I offer my mind, my perspective, and my loyalty." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alicia could feel the eyes of the nobles, the curiosity in their gaze. They did not yet understand her, but perhaps they were beginning to see something they hadn't expected. The king said nothing for a long moment, his gaze never leaving hers. The air around them seemed charged with something unspoken, and Alicia held her ground, unwilling to look away. Finally, Aldric nodded slowly, his lips curving into the slightest of smiles. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You would make an interesting queen, Lady Alicia," he said. His voice, though calm, held a weight that made her heart skip. "I will keep my eye on you." His words were a promise and a warning all at once. The crowd, still hushed, seemed to collectively exhale as the tension in the air lifted, but Alicia was not sure if she was relieved or terrified. There was something in his tone. in the way he studied her that unsettled her deeply. King Aldric turned his gaze back to the next noblewoman, and the moment passed. But Alicia stood frozen in place. Her heart was still racing, her hands clammy. He had not rejected her, but neither had he accepted her fully. He was watching, waiting, testing. Alicia knew this encounter was only the beginning. The king had acknowledged her, but what did it truly mean? The real game had only just started, and now, with a deep breath, she took her first step back toward the sidelines, her mind already spinning with the implications of the king's words. The court may have moved on, but her journey had just begun. The grand hall seemed to close in on Alicia as she stood at the edge of the court, watching the other noble daughters present themselves one by one. The weight of King Aldric's gaze still lingered on her, though she couldn't see him now. He had turned his attention to the next girl, and the ritual continued without pause. The other daughters were performing flawlessly, their wolves at their side, their bodies shifting with ease, displaying the power that made them valuable. The court watched with bated breath, admiration and envy in their eyes. Alicia's heart drummed painfully in her chest as the next noblewoman, Lady Rowan of House Belvoir, stepped forward. Her wolf, a massive golden creature with fur that shimmered in the light, stood by her side, its eyes fierce with loyalty. Lady Rowan shifted with a practiced grace, her transformation smooth and effortless. The wolf bowed its head to the king, and the court responded with applause, the sound ringing through the hall like a celebratory anthem. Alicia's throat tightened. She had watched it all evening, the powerful displays of strength, the unity between the daughters and their wolves, and now all she had was a silence that felt more like a verdict than anything else. As the next girl stepped forward, Alicia felt the growing weight of her own impending moment. Her turn was coming, and she could feel the eyes of the entire court turning toward her as she stood alone, without her wolf. She had never felt so exposed. The court expected something they could not see. Lord Varian, her father, stood a few paces away, his jaw tight with worry. Alicia could hear the soft shuffle of his feet against the stone floor as he fidgeted, the only sign of his growing anxiety. His eyes were on her, urging her to do what she had been trained to do. But she had no wolf to show, no great transformation to perform. She was nothing but herself. Alicia of House Lawnhaven, the herald's voice cut through her thoughts. It was her name ringing out, and she felt every syllable like a weight pressing her down. There was no more avoiding it. Her heart leapt into her throat as she slowly made her way toward the center of the room, her footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. Her movements were stiff, controlled, as though every muscle in her body was determined not to betray the fear she felt. The nobles parted before her, their eyes sharp, waiting for the girl who dared to stand without a wolf. When she reached the center of the hall, the king's eyes met hers once again. His gaze was still as intense as it had been earlier, but now there was something different, something almost unreadable in the depths of his amber eyes. "Lady Alicia," the king said, his voice low and commanding, "you have no wolf to present. What will you offer this court in place of the bond that defines us all?" The words stung, but they weren't unexpected. She had known this moment would come, had known the question would be asked. It was the very reason she had prepared herself to speak, to offer something that wasn't tied to the power of the shift. The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Alicia inhaled deeply, standing taller as she faced the king. Her eyes never wavered from his. "Your Majesty, while I cannot offer the power of the wolf, I offer the strength of my heart, the loyalty of my mind, and the wisdom of my hands. I will serve this kingdom not with the bond of the beast, but with the bond of thought and action." Her voice was steady, despite the nerves trembling beneath her composure. The court had fallen into a tense silence. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the sharpness of their thoughts, but she didn't flinch. She had learned to endure this kind of scrutiny before. She had faced it all her life, and tonight she would face it again, with everything she had. The king's gaze remained fixed on her. The intensity of it was unnerving, and yet Alicia stood her ground. There was a tension in the air now, as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for the king's reaction. After a long moment, he nodded, his amber eyes gleaming with something she couldn't quite place. "You speak with conviction," King Aldrich said, his voice soft but firm. "But words alone are not enough to prove your worth. You must show that you can lead, that you can stand beside me, not as a shadow, but as an equal." Elysia's chest tightened, but she nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. There would be no easy path for her, no simple acceptance. The king had given her a chance, but that was all. She would have to prove herself in ways she had never anticipated. And yet there was something in his eyes now, an unspoken challenge, a challenge she wasn't sure she could refuse. "I will prove myself," Elysia said, her voice steady, a flicker of defiance lighting her gaze. "And I will do so on my own terms." The king's lips twitched as if he were about to speak, but then he turned his gaze away from her, signaling the end of the presentation. "Very well," he said simply. "We shall see." The court, still in stunned silence, slowly began to murmur again. Elysia stood there for a moment longer, feeling the eyes of the nobles on her. Then, with one last glance toward the king, she turned and walked back toward the sidelines, her heart still racing but now filled with a glimmer of determination. Her journey had only just begun. The room fell into an oppressive silence as King Aldrich's decision lingered in the air. Elysia stood at the edge of the court, her back straight, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The other noble daughters, who had all displayed their wolves with such ease, were now whispering amongst themselves, their glances shifting between her and the king. The weight of their judgment was palpable, but it was nothing compared to the stillness that enveloped her, as she awaited the king's final choice. King Aldrich had yet to speak, his eyes locked on the gathered women, his expression unreadable. Elysia couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety rise within her. She had offered herself, her mind, her loyalty, everything she could muster. But was it enough? Was it ever going to be enough? The murmurs of the court grew louder, but no words came from the king. Elysia stood frozen in place, uncertain if she was holding her breath or if the world around her had simply stopped moving. Finally, the king spoke, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "The time has come to choose," he said, his tone rich with authority, and yet tinged with something softer, almost thoughtful. "Each of you has proven your strength in different ways, but only one can stand beside me as my queen." Elysia felt her stomach tighten at the sound of his words. This was the moment that would change everything. The choice would define her future and the future of her family. There could be no turning back after this. The king stood from his throne, his gaze sweeping over the room as if considering every noble daughter, weighing them against each other. His amber eyes moved from face to face, lingering for a moment on the powerful displays of wolves that had been showcased, but then his gaze stopped. It stopped on her. Elysia's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the full force of the king's attention, and it made her pulse race faster. She had stood before him earlier, had made her case, but now, in the thick silence of the hall, it felt as if he could see straight through her. "Lady Elysia," the king spoke again, his voice soft but firm, "you do not possess the power of the wolf. But you have shown me something else, something that cannot be measured by shifting alone." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if choosing his words carefully. "You have shown me courage, the courage to stand before this court without the protection of a wolf, to speak your mind when all others were silent. That is no small thing." Elysia felt a chill run down her spine, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had not expected this. She had prepared herself for rejection, but not for this kind of acknowledgement. The king had seen something in her that was not tied to her ability to shift. It was the one thing she could offer, the one thing no one else could. The king's gaze softened, and he took a step toward her, his presence overwhelming. The entire court was watching, waiting for his next words. "I choose you, Lady Elysia of House Lawnhaven," he said, his voice reverberating through the room, filling every corner of the hall. His words hit her like a storm, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She had not prepared for this. A mix of emotions flooded her, relief, disbelief, a rush of fear, and strangely, a glimmer of something else. Hope. The king had chosen her, despite her lack of a wolf, despite all the traditions of the kingdom that told her she was less than the others. The room exploded into hushed whispers, a wave of astonishment spreading like wildfire through the nobles. Alicia felt the eyes of every single person in the hall on her, but it wasn't the judgment she had anticipated. There was shock, yes, but there was also something else, something unfamiliar and warm. Respect, perhaps, or at least the seed of it. Her father's hand, which had been tight at his side, suddenly reached out to her. Lord Varian's expression was one of relief and pride, though he too was struggling to understand the magnitude of the king's choice. Alicia's mind was spinning. She had been chosen. It was more than she could have dreamed, but it also meant that the road ahead would be anything but easy. She would be under the scrutiny of the court, under the watchful eye of King Aldric, and she would have to prove herself in ways she never could have imagined. The king turned his attention to the court again, addressing the nobles. "Lady Alicia will stand beside me as my queen," he announced, his voice firm and resolute. "Together we will lead Valdhorn into a new era, one where strength is not only defined by the wolf, but by the heart of those who rule." As the king spoke these words, Alicia could feel the weight of them settling over her, heavy with the responsibility of what was to come. She had been given a chance, perhaps the only chance she would ever have. The question now was whether she could live up to it. Her heart was still racing, her body trembling slightly, but the fear was starting to fade, replaced by the flicker of determination. The king had chosen her, and she would prove him right. The days following King Aldric's decision passed in a blur for Alicia. The palace, once a place of dread, had become her new reality. She had been chosen by the king, a proclamation that seemed to echo in every corner of Valdhorn. Whispers travelled fast, and the court was abuzz with rumours, speculation, and in some cases, open disdain. Alicia's new life had begun, but it wasn't without its challenges. In the grandeur of the royal palace, she often found herself alone, surrounded by opulent decor that seemed to mock her sense of worth. The courtiers who once regarded her with curiosity now viewed her with skepticism. It was clear that her selection had not been welcomed by all. Lord Varian had done his best to keep his pride hidden, but even he could not hide the unease in his eyes. His once solid confidence had been replaced by a quiet, gnawing worry. Alicia understood the reason behind it. The nobles had always believed in the strength of the wolf, of shifting, of power. They saw no place for someone like her, who lacked that physical bond with the beast. And yet, despite the murmurs and the cold glances from the other families, King Aldric had remained steadfast. He had welcomed Alicia into his side, making it clear that her intellect, her heart, and her courage would be enough. At least, that's what she kept telling herself as she walked through the long, shadowed corridors of the palace, preparing for her next royal duty. But even as she took her place beside the king, doubt clung to her like a second skin. The court may have accepted her, or at least tolerated her presence for now, but Alicia could sense that her true challenge had only just begun. Her acceptance, though seemingly swift, had been followed by an undercurrent of resentment, a quiet but palpable opposition. It was the smaller moments that gave it away. Faint, dismissive glances as she entered rooms, whispers that died quickly when she approached. And then there were the more blatant displays. At one of the royal banquets, a nobleman from House Vorlan, a powerful family known for their fierce wolves, had openly questioned the king's decision in front of the court. "Your Majesty," Lord Garrick had said, his voice dripping with contempt, "it is hard to believe that the kingdom will flourish under the guidance of one who lacks the power of the wolf. A queen without the strength to lead is a poor choice for Valdhorn. Are we not a kingdom built on strength?" The room had fallen into a stunned silence, every eye trained on the king and Alicia. Even King Aldric, who was known for his unshakable composure, had briefly stiffened, his amber eyes flashing with the hint of something dangerous. Alicia's heart had tightened in her chest as she had held her ground. She had not been trained to withstand this kind of challenge. But in that moment, standing before the court, she realized something. Lord Garrick and the others like him saw only the surface of things. They saw the wolf and the shifting, and thought that this defined true power. What they did not see, what they could not understand, was that power came in many forms. She was not without strength, she had never been without strength. King Aldric's voice had cut through the tension, low and commanding. "Lord Garrick," he had said, his tone unwavering, "the strength of a ruler is not determined by a shift alone. A queen leads with more than just her beast. She leads with her mind, her vision, and her heart. Lady Alicia has proven that to me, and it is enough." The king's words had silenced the room, but the damage had been done. The air was thick with the discontent of those who did not agree with the king's choice, and though the issue had been swept under the rug with an air of finality, Alicia knew the battle was far from over. In the days that followed, she found herself increasingly isolated, not just by the cold treatment of the court, but by her own uncertainty. She had the king's support, but it was clear that he was willing to fight her battles for her. There would come a time when she would have to fight her own. It wasn't just the court that opposed her choice. There were rumors swirling in the outer reaches of the kingdom, whispers of noble families rallying together, secretly forming alliances. They questioned whether a queen who couldn't shift could truly be the ruler Valdhorn needed. Some even spoke of rebellion, though nothing concrete had yet come to light. Alicia often found herself retreating to the quieter parts of the palace, where she could think without the prying eyes of the court. The weight of the kingdom's expectations was heavy, but she could feel a growing fire inside her. She would not let the doubts of others define her. She would prove not just to the court but to herself that she was worthy of standing beside King Aldric. It wasn't just her own future she was fighting for, it was the future of the kingdom itself. And as the moonlight filtered through the palace windows that night, Alicia stood tall in front of the mirror, her reflection sharp and determined. The path ahead was treacherous, but she would face it head-on. She had no wolf, but she had something far more valuable, her strength of will. The royal palace, once a symbol of grandeur, now felt like a labyrinth to Alicia. Each hallway she walked through seemed to stretch farther than the last, the cold marble floors echoing beneath her boots. The walls, adorned with tapestries depicting the kingdom's past victories, appeared to close in around her, as if they were bearing witness to every step she took toward her uncertain future. Despite the wealth and opulence that surrounded her, there was a palpable sense of isolation she couldn't shake. Since her selection as queen, the whispers had only grown louder. Some of the courtiers were civil, but it was obvious that most of them viewed her as an oddity, a mismatch to the traditions they had clung to for centuries. She was the first to be chosen not for the power of her wolf, but for the strength of her mind and spirit, a decision that challenged everything they knew about leadership. Alicia often found herself retreating to the quieter parts of the palace, away from the sharp eyes of the court. The wing where the royal library stood was her favorite, a sanctuary filled with books, maps, and scrolls from all across Valdhorn. She had always found solace in the written word. Knowledge was her weapon, her shield, the thing that set her apart. Here she could forget the weight of the crown she was expected to wear, if only for a few moments. One afternoon she was poring over an ancient map, tracing the borders of Valdhorn with her fingers, when a soft knock at the door startled her. She hadn't expected visitors, especially not after the cold reception she had received during her last appearance at court. Alicia looked up to find Seraphine, one of the royal wolves, standing in the doorway. The large she-wolf had a commanding presence, her fur a mixture of silver and midnight black, and her eyes gleamed with an intelligence that rivaled her own. "I didn't mean to disturb you, my queen." Seraphine's voice was low yet firm as she entered the room, her movements fluid like a shadow. "The king wishes to see you." Alicia felt a flutter in her chest at the mention of the king's name. It had only been a few days since the royal announcement, but she could feel the weight of every conversation they had shared so far. Though the king had spoken highly of her, he had kept his distance, observing her from a place of authority. She knew he was a man of action, not of words. But she also understood that her place at his side was something he had not yet fully embraced. "I'll be there shortly," Alicia said, her voice steady despite the sudden nervousness that took root in her stomach. She had not expected a summons so soon. The king's intentions were often unclear, but she knew that every encounter with him carried significance. Seraphine nodded, and with a graceful turn she left the room. her presence lingering like a storm cloud. Alicia stood up from the desk and straightened her gown, taking a moment to compose herself before stepping out into the corridor. The air in the palace had a chill to it, though the warmth of the early afternoon sun still filtered through the towering windows. As she made her way down the hall, Alicia couldn't help but reflect on the king's choice. When he had named her as his future queen, she had felt a mixture of disbelief and fear. The responsibilities were staggering, yet, despite everything, a part of her felt the stirrings of something deeper. She wasn't just standing by his side, she was expected to rule alongside him. King Aldric had not been one to speak of his past often, but Alicia knew that his reputation as the Alpha King was built on more than just brute strength. The legends spoke of his unmatched leadership, his ability to unite the most powerful wolves in the land. But behind the strength, there had to be something more, something that made him choose her, of all people, to be his queen. As she reached the king's chambers, the door opened silently as if waiting for her. The room was bathed in the dim, golden light of the afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the walls. King Aldric stood by the window, his broad back facing her. His cloak, embroidered with the insignia of Waldhorn, fluttered slightly in the breeze. He looked as imposing as ever, his posture perfect, but there was something in the stillness of his presence that made her feel uneasy. "Alicia," he said, his voice deep, like the rumble of distant thunder. He didn't turn around immediately, and for a moment the silence stretched between them. "You've spent much time in the library, I see." She hesitated, then stepped into the room, her gaze settling on the back of his form. "I find peace there," she said softly. "The world outside this palace is overwhelming." King Aldric finally turned to face her, his amber eyes locking with hers. There was a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze before it softened. He was still the king, the ruler of this kingdom, the alpha of the wolves. Yet in this moment Alicia saw a man burdened by his responsibilities, just as she was. "Peace is a rare thing in this palace," he said quietly, his voice almost contemplative. "But it's something we both need, isn't it?" For a heartbeat, Alicia felt a connection between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. She nodded, though her mind was still racing. "What is it you need from me, Your Majesty?" she asked, her tone steady but laced with curiosity. King Aldric stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "I need you to be ready. There will be no rest for us, Alicia. Not now, not ever." Alicia met his gaze without flinching. She knew this would be the truth of their lives together. And she was ready. Alicia's footsteps echoed through the corridors of the royal palace as she made her way to the training grounds. It was early morning and the sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The air was cool, and a crisp breeze blew in from the open courtyard, brushing against her skin. The palace was quiet at this hour, the usual bustle of servants and courtiers still a few hours away. Her mind, however, was far from quiet. The king's words still lingered in her thoughts, and she knew that the path ahead would not be easy. Even now, with the title of queen declared, the court still regarded her with skepticism. There was little trust in someone who had not been born into the wolf bond, whose strength was not immediately visible. In their eyes, she remained an outsider, an anomaly in a kingdom defined by its ancient traditions. But there were whispers that reached her ears, whispers that spoke of change, of possibilities. King Aldric had chosen her not for her lack of a wolf, but for the mind and spirit she possessed. He had seen something in her, something no one else had, and that realization had sparked a flicker of hope within her. As she rounded the corner, the training grounds came into view. The space was vast, with large open areas for combat practice, archery ranges, and areas for the royal wolves to train. A low growl echoed from the far side of the field, and Alicia's eyes instinctively moved toward the sound. There, among a small group of royal wolves, stood Seraphine. The large she-wolf was easily recognizable with her silver and black fur, her eyes gleaming with intelligence and pride. Alicia had come to know Seraphine over the past few days, though their interactions had been limited to polite exchanges. The royal wolves were an enigma to her, creatures who commanded respect not only because of their power, but because of their bond to the royal family. They were as much a part of the monarchy as the king himself, each one trained to serve and protect with unmatched loyalty. Seraphine noticed Elysia approaching and with a graceful bound trotted over to her. The she-wolf's powerful form was striking, but it was her eyes, those sharp golden eyes, that held Elysia's attention. Seraphine stopped a few paces away and sat, her head tilted slightly as if waiting for Elysia to speak. "Good morning, Seraphine," Elysia said softly, her voice steady, despite the weight of the day ahead. She had never been particularly skilled with animals, much less werewolves, but she had always understood the unspoken bonds that connected creatures to each other. Seraphine had a presence about her that demanded respect, but there was something else, a subtle invitation to trust, to learn. Seraphine's growl was softer now, more of a rumble than a challenge, as she lowered her head slightly, acknowledging Elysia's presence. The sound was almost like a greeting, and for the first time Elysia felt a sense of calm wash over her. The royal wolves had always been symbols of power, of strength, but Seraphine reminded her that there was something deeper at play here. The wolves were not just beasts to be tamed, they were guardians, protectors, and companions to the royal family. "You're wondering how you fit into all of this, aren't you?" Seraphine's voice cut through the air unexpectedly, though it wasn't in the same way others spoke. It was a low, resonant tone, more a mental projection than a sound. The voice of the wolf. Elysia blinked, surprised by the sudden shift, but it was clear that Seraphine had sensed her uncertainty. Elysia nodded slowly, her heart still racing, though a sense of understanding began to form. "I don't belong in this world," she admitted quietly, though her words were more for herself than the she-wolf. "The court, the nobles, they expect strength. Strength in the form of shifting of power I don't have." Seraphine's golden eyes met hers, and for a long moment there was silence. Elysia couldn't read the she-wolf's expression, but there was an undeniable presence in the air, something that felt almost like empathy. Then, as if to answer her unspoken question, Seraphine spoke again. "Strength is not just in the wolf, Elysia. It is in the heart, in the will to stand when others falter, in the ability to lead when it feels impossible. I have seen the king choose many, but he chose you because he saw what others do not. Do not doubt that strength." Elysia's breath caught at the words. They were simple, yet they carried a weight that echoed in her chest. She had heard much of King Aldric's wisdom, but hearing it now from Seraphine, one of the royal wolves, a creature who had stood by his side for so long, shifted something inside her. The king had chosen her not for her abilities, but for her heart. The wolves knew this as much as the king did. "Thank you," Elysia murmured, her voice a little steadier now. Seraphine gave a low, almost approving sound, and turned to the group of wolves. Elysia followed the she-wolf's gaze to see them training in the distance, moving with precision, their speed and agility remarkable. She realized that Seraphine wasn't simply a protector of the king. She was part of something greater, a force that balanced power with purpose. And in that moment, Elysia felt a shift within herself. She might not have the strength of the wolf, but she had something that was just as valuable. She had the will to lead, the will to stand by King Aldric's side and prove that a different kind of strength was possible. The royal court had grown accustomed to Elysia's presence, though their acceptance remained tentative. The whispers were quieter now, though still present, lingering just beneath the surface. Her title as Queen-in-Waiting had solidified, but the true test lay ahead. She knew she could not simply rest on the king's choice. She had to prove her worth, not just to the court, but to herself, to King Aldric, and to the kingdom. King. The king's summons had come late in the evening, a message carried by one of his trusted guards, a quiet urgency in his tone. Elysia was accustomed to the rhythms of the palace now, the subtle commands and expectations that came with being by the king's side. But this time something was different. There was no feast, no gathering of the nobles. She was to meet the king alone at the training grounds at dawn. As Elysia made her way through the corridors, the cool morning air kissed her skin, sharp against her nerves. The palace, still heavy with sleep, was quiet. save for the soft thud of her boots against the stone floor. The sun had not yet risen, and the shadows stretched long and dark across the empty halls. She reached the training grounds to find the king standing alone, his back to her, his silhouette framed by the first light of dawn. He was a figure of raw power, the cloak of Valdhorn's royal sigil billowing slightly in the morning breeze. His presence was imposing, but there was an unexpected tension in the air, something more than just his usual command. Alicia approached carefully, her heart beating faster now. She had grown accustomed to being in his presence, but today felt different. The weight of expectation was heavier, almost suffocating. "You asked for me, Your Majesty?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying a hint of uncertainty. She could not shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. King Aldric turned to face her, his amber eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pause. He studied her for a moment, as if deciding something in that brief second. "I did," he said, his voice low but resolute. "There is a task, a challenge, that you must face." Alicia's brow furrowed. "A challenge," she repeated, unsure of what he meant. The king nodded. "You have stood before the court and claimed your place, but now it is time to prove that you are not just a figurehead, but a true leader. There is a rogue wolf in the kingdom, one who has been causing trouble on the outskirts of our lands. A wolf who does not follow the laws of the pack, one who has refused the Alpha's command." A chill ran down Alicia's spine. "And you want me to deal with this rogue wolf?" "Yes," the king replied, his tone sharp, though there was a flicker of something softer beneath the surface. "I cannot leave the palace to hunt it down myself, but this is your test. You will prove your courage and your ability to lead by handling this threat. Alone." Alicia's breath caught in her chest. This was not what she had expected. She had imagined tasks of diplomacy, perhaps organizing the court, learning the intricacies of ruling by the king's side. But to face a rogue wolf, someone who defied the very essence of the kingdom's power, was a different matter entirely. "You are asking me to go into the wilds to face a creature who has defied you," Alicia said, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "By myself." The king's gaze softened, his expression unreadable. "I'm asking you to face your fear, Alicia. I'm asking you to prove that you are more than just my queen in title. You are my partner in this kingdom. I will not lead alone, and neither will you. You must show the court that you are capable, that you are worthy of your place here." Alicia's heart pounded in her chest. The king had given her an ultimatum, a trial that could either solidify her place beside him or expose her as weak. The rogue wolf was no mere animal. It was a symbol, a test of her strength, her resolve. "What if I fail?" she asked quietly, though the question lingered in the air longer than she intended. The king's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Failure is not an option, Lady Alicia. You are the future of this kingdom. You must show the court that you have the heart to lead, the strength to face the challenges that lie ahead." Alicia stood still for a moment, her mind racing. She had faced challenges before, political intrigue, cold stares, whispers behind her back. But this was different. This was real. This was her proving she had the courage to stand beside a king who had already made his decision. "I will do it," she said, her voice steady, her mind made up. A faint smile flickered across King Aldric's face, though it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I knew you would." With those words, the king turned toward the horizon, where the first rays of the sun were beginning to break over the distant mountains. Alicia took a deep breath and followed him, knowing that this challenge would be the defining moment of her reign. The sun hung low in the sky as Alicia rode through the dense forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. Her horse's hooves pounded against the soft ground, and though she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of travel, today was different. There was a heavy weight on her chest, a mixture of fear and anticipation as she ventured further into the wilderness. The rogue wolf whom she had been tasked to find was somewhere out there. The king's words echoed in her mind. "Failure is not an option, Lady Alicia." He had believed in her, but now, more than ever, she feared letting him down. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a test of her worth, a test that could either confirm her place as queen or expose her as nothing more than an impostor. Elysia pulled the reins to slow her horse, her eyes scanning the trees around her. She was alone, no guards, no wolves, just her and the wild. The quiet was unsettling. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind had gone still. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then a sound, a rustling in the underbrush. Her heart skipped a beat, and she immediately urged her horse forward, her hand gripping the hilt of the sword she carried at her side. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but she couldn't place it. The sound grew louder, and a low growl rumbled from the distance. Elysia's breath hitched as she scanned the trees. The rogue wolf was close. Suddenly she heard a voice she hadn't expected to hear. "Elysia!" The voice was low, steady, and unmistakable. Elysia whipped her head around to see a figure step out from behind a tree. It was Lord Varian, her father. For a moment she could only stare, her mind reeling. "Father?" she asked, confusion and suspicion creeping into her voice. "What are you doing here?" Lord Varian's face was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture, something guarded about him. "I'm here to ensure your safety," he said, his tone almost too calm. "I couldn't let you go alone. It's too dangerous." Elysia frowned. "But why didn't you come to the palace? Why come here alone?" Her father took a deep breath, his gaze shifting nervously toward the woods. "There are things I've kept from you, Elysia, things that you need to know." A chill ran down Elysia's spine. "What things?" she demanded, her voice tightening. Lord Varian hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice lower now. "The rogue wolf you are hunting isn't just any outcast. He's been sent by those who wish to see your reign fail. There are factions within the court who do not believe in your rule. They've been plotting against you, and against King Aldrich." Elysia's mind raced. "What do you mean? Who would do such a thing?" Lord Varian's face hardened. "People who think the throne should be theirs. People who think your lack of the wolf bond makes you unworthy. They've been stirring discontent in the kingdom, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rogue wolf is only the beginning." Elysia felt as though the ground beneath her feet had been ripped away. Her father, the one person she thought she could trust above all others, had been keeping this secret from her. "And you've known about this all along?" she asked, her voice rising in disbelief. Lord Varian didn't meet her gaze. "I've had my reasons. The factions are powerful, Elysia. Even now they are watching, waiting for you to make a mistake." Elysia felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Her own father had been part of the very network working against her, against the king. She had known the court was filled with political intrigue, but this was far worse than she could have imagined. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "They want you out of the way," Lord Varian replied, his voice now harsh, resigned. "And they'll use any means necessary to do so. Including this rogue wolf." Elysia's heart pounded in her chest. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent witnesses to the conversation that threatened to destroy everything she had fought for. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. This was more than a test of her leadership. This was a fight for survival. "I trusted you," Elysia whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I trusted you to protect me." Lord Varian's expression softened for a moment, but he quickly masked it, his gaze hardening again. "I did what I thought was best. You are my daughter. I only wanted to keep you safe." "Safe?" Elysia scoffed, shaking her head. "You've endangered me more than anyone ever could." There was a moment of silence, a stillness that hung heavy in the air, before Lord Varian spoke again. "They know you're here, Elysia. We don't have much time. If you want to protect the throne, you must act now." Elysia stared at her father, her emotions swirling in a storm of anger, betrayal, and determination. The court had always been a dangerous place, but this was war. She could no longer trust those she once called allies. With a deep breath, she turned toward the woods. "I'll finish this," she said, her voice steely, resolved. I'll stop this rogue wolf, and I'll stop them. The tension that had taken root in Elysia's chest only grew as the days passed. Her father's confession had shaken the foundations of everything she thought she knew. The realization that Lord Varian, the man who had raised her, had been involved in the conspiracies against her, was a wound that wouldn't easily heal. But there was no time for grief, no room for doubt. The stakes were higher now than ever before. Elysia had barely slept, her thoughts racing as she prepared for the next move. She had to confront the rogue wolf, yes, but she also had to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, of the factions that were plotting in the shadows. They were growing stronger, more brazen, and with her own father's involvement, Elysia could no longer afford to sit idly by. As she stood in the palace gardens, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the carefully manicured hedges, Elysia felt a cold resolve settle over her. She had always been able to think her way through challenges, to outwit her opponents. But now there was more at play. Her survival and the survival of the kingdom depended on more than just intelligence. It depended on unity. Elysia knew that she couldn't do this alone. She needed the king's support, but more than that, she needed the loyalty of those around her. She needed the court's trust, and that of the royal wolves who had long been by King Aldric's side. The question was, could she earn it? Her thoughts were interrupted as Seraphine approached, her graceful form moving silently through the garden. The she-wolf was a constant presence now, her eyes ever watchful, her loyalty unwavering. Elysia had begun to rely on her more and more, not just for protection, but for the wisdom that Seraphine seemed to carry effortlessly. "Lady Elysia," Seraphine spoke, her voice clear and steady. "The king requests your presence." Elysia nodded, the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. "Lead the way," she replied. As they walked together toward the royal chambers, Elysia's mind churned. She knew that King Aldric was no stranger to the politics of the court, but she also knew that he was a man of action. He would not tolerate betrayal, and the time for subtlety was drawing to a close. When they reached the king's chambers, Elysia hesitated for only a moment before entering. Inside, the king stood by the window, his back to her as usual. His posture was rigid, his figure outlined by the fading light of the day. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty?" Elysia asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. King Aldric turned slowly, his amber eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. He didn't speak immediately, his gaze weighing her in a way that felt both assessing and something else. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, though it was barely noticeable. "How you've learned of the betrayal within your family," he said, his voice deep, the weight of the words settling between them. Elysia's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she wasn't sure whether he was asking a question or stating a fact. But there was no time to waste. "I know," she said, her voice tight. "I know what my father has been involved in. The factions, the rogue wolf. I understand now how far-reaching the conspiracy is." King Aldric nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then you also understand the danger you're in. The court will move against you if we don't act swiftly." Elysia swallowed hard, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. But there was something in his voice, a quiet confidence, that steadied her. He was here, standing before her, and though the court had doubted her, he had not. "I will act," Elysia said, her voice firm now. "I will stop the rogue wolf, and I will confront the factions working against us. I will not let them take what is rightfully mine." The king took a step forward, closing the distance between them. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that passed between them as they stood face to face. He had always been the alpha, the one who commanded respect with a mere glance. But now it felt as though they were standing together, partners, equals. "You are not alone in this," King Aldric said quietly. "You never were." Elysia's heart surged with something she hadn't expected, hope. She had been prepared to fight this battle alone, to prove herself to the court and to the king. But in this moment, standing beside him, she realized that together they could face anything. The king's hand reached out, placing a gentle but firm touch on her shoulder. "We will face this together, Elysia. The kingdom needs you, and I need you by my side." For the first time since her father's betrayal, Elysia felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't alone. She had a partner in this, someone who believed in her, who would stand by her no matter the cost. "I won't let you down," she said, her voice full of conviction. King Aldric gave her a small but sincere smile. "I know you won't." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared resolve filling the room. It wasn't just about power or the throne anymore. It was about something deeper: trust, loyalty, unity. Elysia wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the future of Valdhorn, and now she knew that she wouldn't have to fight alone. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light filtering through the thick canopy of trees. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. Elysia sat at the edge of the campfire, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. The warmth of the fire did little to ease the cold knot in her stomach. She had come a long way since the king had entrusted her with the task of finding and eliminating the rogue wolf, but tonight it felt like the weight of the world had come crashing down on her. Her father's betrayal still gnawed at her, its sting sharper than any blade. He had been the one person she thought she could trust, the man who had raised her, guided her through the maze of court politics. But now, with the truth laid bare, everything had changed. His involvement with the factions that sought to overthrow the monarchy, it was more than she could bear, but she couldn't let that distract her from the mission at hand, the rogue wolf. It was supposed to be a simple task: track it down, eliminate the threat. But now, with the knowledge of the conspiracy brewing in the shadows, Elysia knew that this was no longer just a matter of hunting down a rogue wolf. It was a fight for her very survival, for the throne. A soft growl cut through the silence, pulling her from her thoughts. Seraphine, the royal wolf, stood just outside the circle of firelight, her eyes gleaming in the dark. The she-wolf had been by her side throughout this journey, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of the stakes. Elysia stood up, her legs stiff from the long ride. "What is it, Seraphine?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension that coiled in her chest. The she-wolf didn't speak, but her eyes moved toward the trees, toward the darkness that lay beyond the camp. Elysia followed her gaze, her heart beginning to race. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sense that they were being watched. Before she could make sense of the feeling, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, cloaked in darkness, his movements fluid and purposeful. Elysia's hand instinctively went to the sword at her side, but the man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I mean you no harm, Lady Elysia," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I come as a messenger." Elysia narrowed her eyes, instinctively distrustful. "A messenger?" "From whom?" she demanded, her grip tightening on her sword hilt. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "From those who seek to ensure the throne remains in its rightful hands, those who want to see King Aldric fall." Her heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am here to offer you a choice," the man said, stepping closer to the firelight. His face was sharp, his features almost too perfect, like a mask. "The king is a powerful ruler, yes, but he is weak in ways that you can exploit. You, Lady Elysia, have something he does not: true loyalty to the throne. And I can help you claim it." Elysia took a step back, her eyes wide. "You're one of them, aren't you? One of the conspirators," she spat, her heart hammering in her chest. "You've been working with my father. You want to overthrow the king." The man's smile faded, but there was no anger in his eyes, only something colder. "You misunderstand, Lady Elysia. I'm offering you the chance to take the throne for yourself, to be more than just the king's shadow, to rule in your own right." Elysia's mind spun. This was the moment she had feared, the moment she knew would come eventually. The factions her father had been involved with, they were offering her the throne. But at what cost? "I will not betray the king," she said, her voice sharp, her decision firm. "I would never plot against him." The man's gaze hardened, his tone turning colder. "You've made your choice, then. But remember, Lady Elysia, the throne does not belong to those who hesitate. The king may have chosen you, but there are others who will never accept you as their queen, and they will make sure you never sit upon that throne." His words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Elysia felt the weight of them settle over her like a storm cloud. Her father's betrayal, the growing opposition within the court, it was all starting to make sense. There was more at play here than she could have imagined. This was no longer just about loyalty or the throne. It was about survival. "Leave now," she commanded, her voice a mix of defiance and dread. "And never return." The man didn't flinch, but his lips curled into a smile once more, though it was filled with nothing but coldness. "Very well, Lady Elysia. But remember, the court is watching. They always are." With that, he melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Elysia stood frozen for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the silence. "Are you all right, my queen?" Seraphine asked, her voice calm but with a note of concern. Elysia took a deep breath, her mind still reeling. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I will find a way to protect the throne, even if it means standing alone." Elysia stood at the edge of the training grounds, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The events of the past few days had left her reeling, each new revelation more staggering than the last. Her father's betrayal, the shadowy figures who sought to use her for their own gain, nothing was as it seemed. And now, with the rogue wolf still at large and the factions plotting against the throne, the weight of the crown pressed heavier on her shoulders than ever before. The king had been distant in the days following the confrontation with the messenger, but she could sense his own unease. He too was aware of the forces gathering against them. Elysia could feel it in the air, thick with tension and uncertainty. She had to act, and quickly, if she was to protect the throne and the kingdom that had been entrusted to her. The sound of hooves approaching broke her from her thoughts. She turned to see Seraphine, the royal wolf, returning from a scouting mission. The she-wolf moved with her usual grace, her eyes scanning the surroundings before she came to a stop beside Elysia. "There is no sign of the rogue wolf," Seraphine said, her voice calm, yet laced with a note of concern. "But I can feel something stirring in the woods. The air is thick with unease." Elysia nodded, her eyes narrowing. "I can feel it too," she replied. "There's more at play here than just one rogue wolf. There are forces within the court and within the kingdom that are conspiring against the throne." Seraphine's golden eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "You are right, my queen," she said, her tone steady but laced with the wisdom that only a creature who had lived through countless battles could possess. "But it is not only the court you must worry about. There are those who have been watching you closely, testing your loyalty." Elysia's heart skipped a beat. "Testing my loyalty," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Seraphine stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Elysia's. "There are factions within the kingdom who believe you are unfit to rule. They will stop at nothing to see you fail. You must prove to them, and to yourself, that you have the strength to lead." Elysia's mind raced. The court had always been a web of intrigue and power plays, but now she realized the stakes were much higher. Her every move was being scrutinized, her every decision weighed against a backdrop of treachery and deception. "I understand," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "I won't let them take what is mine. I will prove to them that I am worthy of this throne." Seraphine's eyes softened, a rare gesture of approval. "You have the strength within you, Elysia. But remember, loyalty is not just about proving yourself to others. It is about proving yourself to those you trust most, the king, the wolves, your people." Elysia nodded, a sense of clarity settling over her. She knew what she had to do now. The road ahead would be difficult, but she would not falter. She would fight for her kingdom, for the throne, and for the future of Valdhorn. As she turned to leave the training grounds, a figure emerged from the shadows, King Aldric. He stood at a distance, his arms crossed over his chest, his amber eyes focused on her. There was a quiet strength about him, a presence that commanded respect without needing to say a word. "You've been quiet, my queen," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "What are you thinking?" Alicia met his gaze, her heart steadying in his presence. "I'm thinking about the future," she replied, her voice firm with conviction. "I'm thinking about the kingdom, about the challenges ahead, and I'm thinking about the loyalty that must be tested." The king studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Loyalty is not just a word, Alicia," he said, stepping closer. "It is action. It is standing by those who have placed their trust in you, even when the world seems determined to tear you down. Are you ready to prove that loyalty?" Alicia met his gaze without hesitation. "I am ready," she said, her voice unwavering. The king's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Then prove it. Stand with me, and together we will face whatever comes. But remember, loyalty is a two-way street. It is not just about you proving yourself to me. It is about me proving myself to you." Alicia's heart swelled at his words, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger in that moment. She had always known that she was not alone in this fight, but hearing the king's words, knowing that he believed in her, made all the difference. "I won't let you down," she said, her voice filled with conviction. The king's smile deepened, and for a moment, the weight of their shared responsibility felt lighter. Together they would face whatever trials awaited them, united in purpose, united in loyalty. The night air was cold as Alicia walked through the castle corridors, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The torches along the walls flickered, casting long shadows on the stone. The weight of the day's events hung over her like a dark cloud. Her conversation with the king had solidified her resolve. She knew what she had to do, but nothing could prepare her for the meeting she was about to have. Earlier that evening, a messenger had arrived with a sealed letter bearing her father's sigil. The letter had been brief, cryptic in its wording, but the message was clear. He wanted to meet her in private, away from the eyes of the court. It could only mean one thing: her father was ready to make his move, and he expected her to join him. Alicia's stomach twisted at the thought. She had trusted him, loved him, and now it felt as though everything she had known was slipping through her fingers. The truth of his betrayal still stung, but she had no choice. She had to confront him, had to hear his words for herself. Only then would she understand why he had turned against everything he had once believed in. She reached the door to the royal chambers where the meeting was to take place. It was slightly ajar, and the faint glow of candlelight leaked into the hallway. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. What if this was a trap? What if he was here to make his final move to break her completely? But then she remembered the king's words. Loyalty is a two-way street. If she wanted to prove her worth, she had to face this head-on. With a deep breath, Alicia pushed open the door. Her father stood in front of the fireplace, his back to her. He was the same man she had known all her life, tall with greying hair and the strong, commanding presence that had made him one of the kingdom's most influential figures. But there was something different in the way he held himself tonight, something guarded, like he was preparing for a battle. "Father," Alicia's voice was steady, but beneath the surface she could feel the storm raging inside her. Lord Varian turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no warmth in his gaze, no sign of the man who had once comforted her, taught her the ways of the court. Only cold calculation. "Alicia," he said, his voice low, almost weary. "You've come." "I had to," she replied, stepping further into the room, her gaze fixed on him. "I need to know why, Father. Why did you do it? Why betray me? Betray the king?" Lord Varian's face tightened, but his eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, or regret. But it was quickly replaced by something sharper. "You think I did this for power, Alicia? For the throne? No. I did it to protect you." Her breath caught in her throat. "Protect me from what? From the king? From the kingdom?" "No," he said, his voice growing harsher now. "From the truth. You're too blind to see it. The throne is not yours. You were never meant to rule. You were never meant to sit by Aldrich's side." Alicia took a step back, her mind reeling. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "This throne is mine by right, you know that." Lord Varian shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Do you really believe that, Elysia? Do you think the people will accept you, a queen without a wolf? You are a symbol, a tool to keep the peace, but not a ruler, not a true leader. Elysia's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known the court had its doubts about her. She had heard the whispers, the criticisms, but to hear her father say it out loud, not a true leader, it cut deeper than she could have imagined. "I am a true leader," she said, her voice rising, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I've fought for this kingdom. I've stood by the king, and I've proven myself. I don't need anyone's approval to rule." Lord Varian's eyes darkened. "You're deluded. You've been manipulated, just as I was. Aldrich doesn't care for you, Elysia. He uses you because you're convenient. You'll never be enough for him." Her father's words were like daggers, each one striking deeper than the last. But Elysia refused to show weakness. She had made it this far, and she would not let him break her now. "Then why did you help him? Why didn't you stop him if you knew he would never care for me?" Her voice cracked with emotion, the dam she had built inside her beginning to break. Lord Varian's face softened for a brief moment, the flicker of something human showing in his eyes. "I never wanted this for you, Elysia. But you were always destined to be the pawn in someone else's game. You were never meant to lead, and Aldrich, he will never accept you, not truly. You are a threat to everything he stands for." Elysia swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "No, father," she said, her voice steady, though it shook with the weight of everything she had learned. "You're wrong. I am the future of this kingdom, and I will prove it, with or without your support." The room grew still, the fire crackling softly in the silence between them. Lord Varian's expression remained unreadable, his eyes distant, as though he had already made peace with his own choices. "I will stand by Aldrich," she said finally, her voice unwavering, "and I will fight for the throne. You can either stand with me or you can leave." Her father didn't answer. He simply turned away, the shadows of betrayal lingering between them, and in that moment, Elysia realized that the battle for the throne wasn't just about loyalty, it was about choosing who to trust in a kingdom built on lies. The palace was silent in the early hours of the morning, a stillness that hung heavy in the air. The first light of dawn filtered through the grand windows, casting a soft glow across the stone walls. Elysia stood at the balcony, her eyes fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. The kingdom stretched out before her, its sprawling fields, forests and castles, a reminder of the responsibility that now weighed on her shoulders. Her conversation with her father echoed in her mind. The betrayal, the harsh truths he had spoken, the coldness in his eyes. It all felt like a distant memory now, but the pain was still fresh. She had hoped for a different outcome, but hope had never been enough to secure the throne. What mattered now was action. What mattered was proving to herself, to the king and to the court that she was ready. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her from her reverie. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. King Aldrich entered the room, his presence commanding, yet there was a quiet intensity in his expression. He was no longer the distant monarch she had first met. He was someone she had come to trust, to rely on. "I was wondering where you had gone," he said, his voice calm but laced with concern. "You've been quiet since last night." Elysia turned to face him, her gaze steady. "I needed some time alone," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "There's a lot to consider." The king nodded, understanding the weight she carried. "I know," he said, "and I understand the burden you bear. But you don't have to carry it alone." She met his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty in her chest. "I know that now," she said, her voice stronger than it had been moments before. "But I also know that this kingdom needs someone who can lead, not out of fear or obligation, but because they believe in what they're fighting for." Aldrich stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've always had that strength, Elysia. From the moment you stood before the court, you proved that. What matters now is whether you believe in yourself enough to lead, to make the choices that will shape the future." Elysia felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, doubt, and something deeper that she couldn't name. She had always been driven, but this was different. This was a fight for something that was bigger than herself, and for the first time she felt ready to embrace it fully. "I do believe in myself," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "And I believe in this kingdom. But I can't do this without you. I never could." The king's eyes softened, his gaze intense yet full of understanding. "And you won't have to. We will face this together as partners, not just as a king and a queen, but as equals." The words struck her deeply, and for a moment, all the tension, all the doubts, seemed to fade into the background. The king had always been a symbol of strength, of power, but in that moment she realized that their partnership wasn't just about two people ruling together. It was about trust, loyalty, and a shared vision for the future. "Thank you," she whispered, the weight of everything they had been through lifting, if only for a moment. The king smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that was rare for him. "No thanks are needed. You're my equal, Elysia. Together we'll ensure that this kingdom stands strong." For the first time in what felt like forever, Elysia allowed herself to relax. There was still much to be done, much to fight for. But now she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. She and Aldrich were bound by more than just the throne. They were bound by their shared purpose, by the strength of their bond. "Then let's begin," Elysia said, her voice filled with determination. "The court may have doubted me, but I will prove them wrong. I will prove that I am worthy of this throne." Aldrich's smile deepened. "I never doubted you for a second." The future of the kingdom stretched before them, uncertain and fraught with challenges, but Elysia knew that, together, they could face whatever came their way. The weight of the crown no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise, one that she was ready to fulfill. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light across the kingdom, Elysia stood tall, her heart steady. She was no longer just the queen in waiting. She was the future of Voldhorn, and she would fight for it.